Imagine just for a second that you pull into a gas station tomorrow morning. You're groggy, maybe a little late for work, and you reach for the pump. But instead of the usual price, the numbers spinning on the dial are moving 4 times faster than yesterday. 400%. That is not inflation. That is a heart attack. That is exactly where this story ends. But to understand how the world drove itself off a cliff at full speed, we have to look at the party before the crash. And oh, what a party it was. Welcome to the early 1970s, the golden twilight of the cheap energy era. If you weren't there, you can't possibly understand the arrogance of it. We were drunk, not on liquor, but on oil. It was the lifeblood of the greatest economic expansion in human history, and we treated it like it was water. Actually, in some places, it was cheaper than water. The entire Western world was built on a single fragile assumption that the black gold flowing out of the desert would never, ever stop, and it would always be practically free. In America, this delusion was made of steel and chrome. We drove land yachts, massive 2-ton beasts with V8 engines that got 12 miles to the gallon, and we didn't care. Why would we? Gas was 30 cents a gallon. You could fill up a tank the size of a bathtub with the loose change in your pocket. The suburbs were exploding, stretching miles away from city centers because the commute was meaningless. We built glass skyscrapers that leaked heat like sieves because air conditioning was cheap. We built an entire civilization that was addicted to a drug we didn't produce enough of, supplied by dealers we barely understood and frequently insulted. We were living in a fool's paradise, cruising at 90 miles an hour with no seatbelt, convinced the road went on forever. But the road was about to end, and the wall we were about to hit was made of pure, unadulterated geopolitics. It begins on October 6th, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. Israel is quiet, fasting, praying. The streets are empty. And then, out of nowhere, the sirens start screaming. Egypt and Syria launch a massive coordinated surprise attack from 2 sides. Caught completely with their pants down, Israel is fighting for its sheer survival. Now, normally, this might have been just another tragic, bloody chapter in a long history of desert warfare. A regional conflict, but this time, Uncle Sam decided to crash the party. Over in Washington, President Nixon is already sweating through his suits because of a little nightmare called Watergate. But he and Henry Kissinger decide they cannot let a key Cold War ally get crushed by Soviet-backed forces. So, the U.S. launches Operation Nickel Grass. This wasn't a subtle care package, folks. This was a massive, in-your-face airlift. We are talking about giant C-5 Galaxy transport planes, the biggest birds in the sky, landing in Israel, unloading tanks, ammunition, and freedom by the ton, right there for the whole world to see. It was a logistical miracle, sure, but politically, it was like lighting a cigar in a dynamite factory. To the Arab nations watching, specifically the members of OPEC, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, this was the ultimate slap in the face. They had explicitly warned the West, stay out of this. And America basically replied, watch this. But here is where the West made the fatal miscalculation. The Americans thought power still came solely from the barrel of a gun. They forgot that their entire economy was running on an IV drip attached to the Saudi desert. The Arab oil producers, led by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, looked at those American planes resupplying their enemy and realized they couldn't win on the battlefield. But they realized they didn't have to. They had a weapon far deadlier than a tank and more precise than a missile. They realized they were the drug dealers, and the Western world was the hopeless junkie. And what happens when the dealer decides to close up shop? The junkie doesn't fight back. The junkie collapses. The decision was made. The valve was about to turn, and the West was about to learn exactly who was really in charge. On October 17, 1973, in a conference room in Kuwait, A group of men in robes effectively rewrote the laws of physics for the Western world. They didn't fire a single bullet. They didn't launch a nuke. They simply issued a press release. The Organization of Arab Petroleum, exporting countries, OAPEC, announced that until Israel withdrew from the occupied territories, they would cut oil production by 5% every single month. Oh, and for the United States and the Netherlands, who had been naughty enough to support Israel, it wasn't just a cut. It was a total, complete embargo. No soup for you. Zero. At first, the suits in Washington and London didn't grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. They thought this was a negotiation tactic, a bluff. It wasn't. It was an economic strangulation. Imagine waking up to find that someone has put a tourniquet around your neck and is slowly tightening it, minute by minute. That is what happened to the global economy. The flow of oil, which everyone assumed was as infinite as the air we breathe, suddenly had a sold-out sign slapped on it. The psychological shock was worse than the financial one. For the first time in modern history, the masters of the universe, the Americans, the Europeans, the industrial giants, were being told what to do by the countries they viewed as nothing more than gas stations with flags. The power dynamic flipped upside down in an afternoon. Panic didn't just set in. It exploded. Ships carrying oil were diverted mid-ocean. Refineries started drying up. The West realized with absolute horror that they had built their entire shiny modern civilization on a foundation of sand, and the tide was coming in fast. They weren't just facing a price hike. They were facing the prospect of the lights going out, the factories stopping, and the cars, those symbols of American freedom, turning into 2-ton paperweights. The party wasn't just ending. The police were here, and they were kicking down the door. Welcome to the queue from hell. If you want to know what the end of the world looks like, it isn't a mushroom cloud. It's a line of station wagons stretching for 3 miles, idling their engines while their drivers slowly lose their minds. Going to the gas station used to be a 5-minute chore. Suddenly, it became a full-time job. You didn't drive to get gas. You camped there. You would wake up at 4 a.m. in the pitch black just to get a spot in line, hoping that by the time you actually reached the pump 3 hours later, the attendant wouldn't come out and tape a cardboard "no gas" sign to the nozzle. When that sign went up, grown men cried. Others threw punches. The social fabric didn't just fray, it snapped. We devolved into tribal warfare over unleaded fuel. You saw neighbors, people who borrowed sugar from each other, getting into fistfights because someone cut the line. And then came the government's brilliant solution: rationing. They instituted the odd-even system. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could buy gas on odd days. If it was even, you waited. It was kindergarten logic applied to the most powerful economy on Earth. The absurdity was suffocating. You had people swapping license plates in parking lots just to get a tank of fuel to go to a job they might get laid off from anyway. And if you think the average commuter was angry, the truckers went nuclear. These guys were the arteries of the nation, and they were bleeding out. They couldn't make a living with fuel prices doubling and speed limits dropping. So, they did what any rational person would do. They shut the country down. They parked their massive rigs across highways, blocking interstates from Pennsylvania to Ohio. It was anarchy on the asphalt. The National Guard had to be called out in some states to keep the roads open. We are talking about armed soldiers protecting gas tankers like they were carrying gold bullion. Meanwhile, in the suburbs, a new crime wave was born: gas siphoning. You couldn't leave your car parked on the street overnight without risking waking up to an empty tank and the smell of spilled fuel. People were sneaking around with garden hoses and jerry cans, sucking the lifeblood out of their neighbors' Chevys. It was pathetic, it was desperate, and it was the new normal. The illusion of civilized society evaporated the moment the needle hit empty. We realized that without that cheap, abundant flow of dinosaur juice, we weren't a superpower anymore. We were just a bunch of angry pedestrians with really expensive driveways. If the gas lines were a punch to the gut, what happened next was a full-blown stroke. We entered the era of the economic impossibility. The experts had a fancy name for it: stagflation. Sounds like a bad stomach bug, right? Trust me, it was worse. In the textbooks, economics is supposed to work like a seesaw. When unemployment is high, prices drop because nobody has money. When everyone is working and spending, prices go up. Simple. Predictable. But 1973 took that seesaw and snapped it in half. Suddenly, we had the worst of both worlds. Inflation was skyrocketing. Your grocery bill, your rent, your clothes, everything cost more every single week. But at the same time, the economy was grinding to a halt, and people were losing their jobs. It was like drowning and burning to death simultaneously. The stock market looked like a crime scene. Wall Street had spent the last 2 decades convincing itself that there were about 50 companies, the Nifty 50, that were invincible. Stocks like Xerox, McDonald's, Polaroid. They were the one-decision stocks. You buy them once and never sell because they only go up. Well, in 1973, Gravity finally filed a lawsuit. The market didn't just correct, it crashed. Over the next 2 years, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost nearly 45% of its value. Adjusted for inflation, it was a bloodbath that rivaled the Great Depression. Retirement funds evaporated into thin air. That feeling of guaranteed prosperity that the boomer generation had grown up with, gone. Poof. This wasn't just a recession. It was the funeral for the post-war golden age. Since 1945, the Western world had enjoyed a historic run of easy growth, cheap energy, and rising wages. We thought we had solved the economic puzzle. We thought we were geniuses. But it turns out we were just sitting on a geyser of cheap oil, and the moment someone put a cap on it, the engine seized up. The factories that had been the envy of the world suddenly looked like rusty relics. The cost of running them was too high. This was the beginning of the Rust Belt, the beginning of the end for American manufacturing dominance. We watched the ticker tape slide into the red, paralyzed, realizing that the rules of the game had changed forever, and nobody had sent us the new rule book. So, while the economy was melting down and truckers were playing bumper cars on the interstate, what was the brain trust in Washington doing? Well, Richard Nixon was a little distracted. He had a few legal issues piling up on his desk. You know, just a minor burglary at the Watergate Hotel. But he had to look like he was in charge, so he launched Project Independence. Great name, right? Sounds like a summer blockbuster movie starring Steve McQueen. The goal was to make the United States completely energy independent by 1980. Spoiler alert, it didn't happen. It was like promising to lose 50 pounds by next Tuesday while holding a cheeseburger. It was political theater, designed to make you feel better while the ship was taking on water. Instead of actual solutions, we got nagging. The government turned into a frantic mother-in-law. The most famous fix? The National Maximum Speed Law, 55 miles per hour. That's right. To save fuel, the federal government decided to turn every highway in America into a school zone. They slapped up signs that said, "Drive 55, arrive alive." But we all knew the real slogan was, "Drive 55, go out of your mind." It was a collective punishment. It turned a 4-hour drive into a 5-hour slog, all to save a thimble of gasoline. People hated it with a passion usually reserved for tax auditors. It didn't save the economy. It just made everyone late and angry. Then came the brilliant idea to extend daylight savings time through the winter. The logic was, if we make the sun stay out later, people won't turn on their lamps. Genius, right? Until parents realized they were sending their 6-year-olds to the school bus stop in pitch black darkness at 7:30 in the morning. Accidents went up. Parents screamed. The experiment was a disaster. They dimmed the lights on the national Christmas tree to show solidarity. They told us to turn down our thermostats and wear sweaters indoors. It was pathetic. It was the spectacle of a superpower realizing it had lost the remote control to the world and was just furiously mashing buttons, hoping the channel would change back. But the channel was stuck, and the show was getting worse. While we were wearing tacky sweaters and getting into fistfights at the pump, something far more permanent was happening behind the scenes. We were witnessing the greatest robbery. Sorry, let's call it a wealth transfer in human history. Money flows like water, always finding the lowest point, and suddenly, the entire economic landscape tilted steeply toward the Middle East. We bled cash. Every time a Westerner filled up their tank at 4 times the old price, they were effectively writing a check directly to Riyadh, Tehran, and Kuwait City. The sheer volume of wealth involved was astronomical. It was a tsunami of dollars crashing onto the desert sands. Overnight, nations that the West had treated as convenient gas stations became the world's bankers. They didn't just buy luxury cars. They bought the companies that made the cars. They bought prime real estate in London, massive chunks of New York banks, and enough U.S. Treasury debt to technically own a piece of the White House. This birthed the era of the petrodollar. It was a beautiful, cynical cycle. We paid them billions for oil. They took that money, which was far too much to spend even if they bought a golden palace every week, and deposited it right back into Western banks. The banks then loaned that money back to Western governments and developing nations to keep their economies on life support. The West was effectively borrowing its own money back, paying interest on its own addiction, just to keep the lights on. And look at the result. In the 1960s, places like Dubai and Riyadh were quiet, traditional towns. But after the flood of 1973, the cranes went up and never came down. They hired Western architects and engineers to build modern marvels, transforming the desert into a sci-fi utopia of glass and steel. They built their future with the bricks we paid for. The center of gravity had shifted permanently. The men in the boardrooms of New York and London looked at the map and realized with a sinking feeling that they were no longer the undisputed captains of the ship. There were new masters of the universe, and they didn't wear pinstripe suits. They wore thobes, and they held the deed to the engine room. The party was finally over, and the cleanup was brutal. The American muscle car, that glorious roaring symbol of excess, didn't just die. It was murdered by the price of a barrel of crude. The legendary GTOs and Mustangs were stripped of their power, neutered into sad, underpowered boxes that couldn't outrun a heavy breeze. In their place came the invaders we used to laugh at, Honda and Toyota. We used to mock their tin cans. But suddenly, those efficient, reliable little engines looked like the smartest engineering on the planet. Detroit, arrogant and slow, was left choking on its own exhaust fumes, watching the Japanese drive away with the market share they would never fully get back. But the real legacy of 1973 isn't about cars. It's about the scar on our collective psyche. For the first time, the modern world looked into the abyss and realized the bottom was visible. We learned that the earth is not a magic bottomless vending machine. We learned that our entire way of life hangs by a thread suspended over a geopolitical fire pit. Did we really learn it, though? We panicked, we conserved, and then we went right back to buying massive SUVs the second prices dropped. 1973 was a warning shot fired across the bow of humanity. It told us that the age of infinite growth on a finite planet is a fairy tale. We survived the crash, sure, but we never really fixed the brakes. We're just driving a little more carefully, staring at the fuel gauge, waiting for the needle to drop again. And next time, the warning light won't just blink. The engine is going to explode.